In our last session, I said that by now you might be being a little bit confused, but not to worry because you're in good company. And the things we've been looking at are things that have been debated by the church and by much greater minds than mine, who've got all sorts of insights, and people can get quite passionate on this subject. We began by saying, is the rapture biblical? And I think we have to conclude that there are significant references throughout the Bible that would suggest that however difficult it is for us to get our heads around it, the rapture is a biblical concept. It is a biblical teaching that it will happen, that believers in Jesus will rise to meet him in the air when he returns. And the bit which is debated is where that fits within the end times. And whilst on one side that's not the main thing, it does help us to actually understand something of our faith when we look at the three views. And what I'm going to do now is compare and contrast the main themes of the rapture, and compare and contrast the three different views to hopefully give you a summary and help you make up your mind of where you feel comfortable. The first view, the pre-tribulation view, is that the rapture happens before the tribulation begins, and it draws on verses like Matthew 24:42, where Jesus says that no one knows the time. And so if nobody knows the time, therefore it must happen before the tribulation, because the tribulation is a known period of time at 7 years. What you could say in response to that is actually, even if the rapture did happen during the tribulation, it would come like a thief in the night when we weren't expecting it. Just because it happens within the tribulation doesn't necessarily mean it has to happen at the beginning. The mid-tribulation view draws on passages like Revelation 14:14, where we see Jesus coming on the clouds, and this is the point where people would say the rapture happens, where Jesus comes on the cloud and he's seen swinging a sickle, firstly for believers and secondly for unbelievers. People who challenge this view would say, however, the church isn't mentioned after Revelation chapter 4 until you get to Revelation 22, so the church isn't present. And people who hold to a post-tribulation view sort of dismiss both of those and say Revelation 20 verses 4 and 5 refer to the first resurrection. So therefore there's no two comings of Jesus. There's no secret rapture and then a resurrection, but actually they happen at the same time. And in response to that you can say, yeah, but Revelation 14:14 happens earlier before you get to Revelation 20. So those are the three sort of main views and how their sort of source and key verses contrast. How these verses are interpreted depends a lot on how you view what Jesus was referring to when he talked about the elect and this time of suffering with tribulation being cut short for the sake of the elect, and how you draw on verses like Deuteronomy and Paul speaking in Colossians. How you balance all of that will affect how you view the tribulation. People who hold to a pre-tribulation view see that the church and Israel are two separate entities, and that when the church and the believers are raptured at the beginning of a tribulation and removed, what's left is a remnant who realise the error of their ways and become witnesses and go through the tribulation, is focused on Israel, the people of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, and so the tribulation refers to Israel and not the church. However, holders of the mid-tribulation and the post-tribulation view would see that as ingrafted branches, the Gentiles become part of the church. And so therefore there's no removing of believers. Rather, the believers have to go through the tribulation, Jews and Gentiles together as the new spiritual Israel. The third area of interpretation would come in how you understand the wrath of God. So holders of the pre-tribulation view would generally see that the wrath of God begins in Revelation 6 when the four horsemen ride out, where what's been holding back, the church has been holding back the Antichrist. And so when Revelation 6 comes and we see the four horsemen riding out, the church has been removed, therefore removing the obstacles to the Antichrist coming. And what we see happening then as the four horsemen ride out is the wrath of God. The challenge to this would then come with a mid-tribulation view, where the wrath of God begins in Revelation 15 and 16, and how from chapter 6 to chapter 14 what you're dealing with is sin having come full course, that actually people are reaping what they sow, and what we're seeing is where God removes the restraints and allows sin to run its course. This is the full effects of sin in all its horror taking place. And when the wrath of God then comes in Revelation 15 and 16, it's a just wrath where God is beginning to judge and deal with all of that sin. And holders of the post-tribulation view would hold on to verses like Revelation 14 verse 12 that says God's people must endure patiently, and John 6:39 to 40 that Jesus will raise them up on the last day, and see that the believers go through the wrath of God as well as the effects of sin.